Good afternoon. I am Dr. Maskaram Gabregzaber, Assistant Clinical Professor and Director of Inclusion and Community Engagement in the School of Human Evolution and Social Change at Arizona State University. I feel incredibly privileged to be able to provide timely and important programming such as today's lecture, and want to thank all of you for joining us. Welcome to the 6th lecture of our new colloquium series titled Toward a Liberatory Theory and Praxis. This monthly series aims to highlight the work of contemporary scholars belonging to identities and traditions marginalized within mainstream Western academia, who through their work confront neocolonial power structures and challenge long-standing norms of knowledge production. It was born out of a demand from our graduate students for exposure to more critical scholarship that is relevant to their lived experiences and the times in which we are living. Specifically, I want to thank Nalubega Ross, Anais Roque, Tisa Lowen, and Aaliyah Hoff, who worked with me to conceptualize the series and establish its parameters. I also want to acknowledge SHESC leadership for supporting and sponsoring this series, specifically our unit director, Dr. Chris Stojanowski. We will have one more talk in April before the series wraps up for the academic year, so keep an eye out for that. We will be back again next fall for a whole new docket of scholars and exciting talks. Before I introduce our speaker today, I want to cover a few housekeeping items. Please note that this presentation will be recorded while the Q&A session to follow will not. You, the audience, will not be visible in the recording, and all of the mics will be off. As I mentioned, we will be leaving time for questions after the talk, and we're asking that you write your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. I will be helping our guest speaker keep track of the questions and select which ones she will answer. So if you would like to vocalize the question yourself rather than have me read it out, please write "Ask Live" in parentheses at the end of the question you submit, and I will call on you and unmute your mic so that you may do so. All right, now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Amanda Tachine. Dr. Tachine is Navajo from Ganado, Arizona. She is, and excuse my poor pronunciation here, Naanesteshi Tachine, Zuni Red Running into Water Clan, born from Tlezilani, Many Goats Clan. She is an assistant professor in the educational leadership and innovation here at Arizona State University. Dr. Tachine's research centers on exploring college access and persistence among indigenous college students using qualitative indigenous methodologies. She is drawn to contribute to research that focuses on systemic and structural barriers that disenfranchise college access for indigenous and marginalized populations. Her dissertation, titled Monsters and Weapons, Navajo Students' Stories on Their Journeys to College, was awarded the 2016 American Educational Research Association Division J Dissertation of the Year. In 2017, she was awarded the Spencer Postdoctoral Fellowship. She has published in the Journal of Higher Education, Qualitative Inquiry, International Review of Qualitative Research, and other scholarly outlets. Dr. Tachine was recognized by President Obama with the White House Champions of Change Young Women Empowering Communities Award for creating University of Arizona's Native SOAR, or Student Outreach for Access and Resiliency, a multi-generation mentoring program to increase college access among Native youth and families. She has also published thought pieces in the Huffington Post, Al Jazeera, The Hill, Teen Vogue, Indian Country Today, Inside Higher Ed, and Navajo Times, where she advances ideas regarding discriminatory actions, educational policies, and inspirational movements. Her talk today is titled Indigenous Presence, Weaponry, and Unbelonging in the Glittering World. Everyone, please join me in welcoming Dr. Amanda R. Tachine.
Thank you for your generous introduction. I'm going to start sharing my screen because my introduction, I want to share some images. I'm a visual learner, and it helps me tell a little bit about my story that I'm going to share with you today. She'eya Amanda Tachine Shia Nanisht Eja Tachine Nishlonk Eslana Bashichin Tkabaha dashiche ado ashihia dashinale, look antia nasha, kut ego atzanishle. I am Zuni, red running into the water clan, born for the Many Goats clan. My maternal grandfather's clan is Water's Edge People clan, and my paternal grandfather's clan is from the Salt clan. I'm originally from Lukantye, which means the patch of wide reeds, also known as Ganado, Arizona. This is how I introduce myself, as a Dene woman. These pictures here are a little bit of explaining what I introduce you today. This act of introduction or presenting the presence is an extension of indigeneity, as an awakening of and acknowledging of relationality, kinship relationships with my people and the land that I come from. It's also being in agreement with my positionality as a Dene woman who is in lineality with generations of matriarchs. Here, a picture here is one of our recent trip back home to Lukantye. As you can see, it's just beautiful. We have an expansive sky, as we do here in Arizona. We're lucky to have the beauty of our skies here. And you can see the different colors of soil that I just love when I used to go running back at home. There's maroon and gray and purple, brown, different colors. And when I tell my kids that we have different colors of sand, they laugh at me. Then I show them, see, here's the purple sand. And they're just in awe when they see the stories I tell them. And then when we go home and they see that, yeah, mom is not just messing around, that this is really where we are from. So this introduction for me, it's a form of decolonizing the space by asserting the relationship of ontological orientations and epistemological connections to this land and this time with my people. In many respects, introducing in this way gives me strength, as it's beautiful reminder that my presence here and now is invoking that I come with ancestors and family. I want to thank you to the School of Human Evolution and Social Change for the invitation to share a part of this, what sounds like a remarkable series. And I did attend one of your sessions. I think it was one of your second ones, and it was wonderful. I know it takes a lot of hard work to think about these sessions, to select the people who are able to share. And I just want to give lift up acknowledgement to Meski Glegzabia, and I'm sorry if I said your name incorrectly. I want to thank you for recognizing not me, but the body of work and the thinking that I'm offering with you all today. I also want to recognize there's a lot of people behind the scenes that make this magic happen on Zoom. And so thank you to many of those who are doing this good work. And I want to thank you for joining us today. It's lunchtime for us in Arizona. And if you have your sandwich or whatever you have for lunch, good, eat it. It's good medicine. And if those of you who are watching this from different time zones and different places and spaces, thank you. In Navajo, that means thank you for taking a little bit of your time to be with us today. It means a lot to me. Currently, I'm an assistant professor in higher education at Arizona State University, as Meski mentioned, which resides on the lands of the Acoma, Atdevish, and Pipash peoples. Pictured here is a walk that my family and I took recently. I was mesmerized about the beauty of the place, the indigenous presence that was and is still present. I think there's a difference between presence versus visibility. Presence imbues more than the sense of seeing or being seen. Presence is an embodiment of being that encompasses sight, hearing, auditory, touch, feeling, smell, olfactory, tasting, movement in spaces, and so much more. That is why I choose to use indigenous presence in my work, because also presence is belonging. They're related. Presence is belonging to a place in all its fullness of senses and being, just like the Akatillo. We know she belongs here, that she blooms in early spring with radiant red flowers that gift nourishment to hummingbirds, and that she protects herself by conserving water during the hot and dry summers. Many of us respect her. We don't just see her, we know her presence that has been in these lands for generations. The O'odham people of these lands know her very well too. They know that her flowers provide nectar that can be eaten for medicinal purposes, that the seeds from the ocotillo were and still are used to make flour for mush or cakes, presents. So I have been thinking more deeply about these questions of presence and belonging in indigenous lands. I've been thinking about these questions. What does it mean for me to be on indigenous lands? What does it mean for you? And what does it mean for institutions? You see, I want to tell you that these questions have been pressing on my heart a lot more recently, especially during a time of COVID-19. I'm also thinking about who defines and sets the terms of belonging. And in my work, because I do higher education, I'm in that field, I'm thinking about who belongs in these college settings, in these spaces, in these talks that we're able to engage in. So COVID-19 is teaching me, and I think it's teaching all of us so much. So much, if we were to able to really think about it, it would make us cry, maybe giggle. There would conjure up so many emotions during this time. And just in thinking about that, I've been thinking a lot about the way our life has unfolded in the year. So in this past year, I had a beautiful daughter who graduated from high school, and our families near and far watched her graduation via online. It wasn't something that we were anticipating, but it's something that we rolled with, so to speak. I have my little one who's all on Zoom. All my children are on Zoom. Our first grader here is on Zoom. And so we're learning to connect through online ways. Also learning about the relationality of the importance of this land, the desert land. I'm not from this region. As I showed you a picture, I'm from northern Arizona, where the temperature and the landscape is different. So respecting that this desert land can nourish us and has nourished us and will nourish us. And so a picture in the middle is our wonderful work through a community garden that we have in downtown Phoenix area. And we call in our garden called Earthseed, in respects and in thinking of Octavia Butler's Parables of the Sawyer and her thinking about why she started gardening. And so we're, teaching that with our little ones and ourselves as well. And then on the picture there is a textile rug. So this time of the pandemic, I've been able to really strengthen in my ability to weave, to carry on the teachings of my ancestors, and to see the interconnections of relationality as I take my loom and sit in front of my loom and remember stories. It gives me strength. So threaded through all of this is, as you can see, there's so much imbued. And for me, it's really understanding and respecting relationality, the sacredness of people and the sacredness to the land and our history. Ojibwe scholar Megan Bang offered a perspective that challenged ideas of social distancing to one that fosters social closeness, that facilitate both the spatial arrangements and relational constructs needed to weather through the storms of COVID-19. And we must add the social unrest that continues to unfold. Bang emphasized that social closeness is needed. I agree. And extend that through social closeness, love is needed. Yet we also must understand that, as Bell Hooks stated in quotes, love is an act of will, namely both an intention and an action. Will also implies choice. We do not have to love, we choose to love. So I've been reading Bell Hooks all about love in the last year, and I think many of us may be reading more so than we've ever have, and engaging in the literature of so many wonderful people. And in reading Bell Hooks, this quote gets to me each time. As many of us have felt the pain and the loss of a loved one, a neighbor, maybe a stranger, a friend that you didn't talk to in a long time, an elder. So my heart goes out to you and to those who have journeyed on. And then Bell Hooks writes, contemplating death has always been a subject that leads me back to love. Significantly, I began to think more about the meaning of love as I witnessed the deaths of many friends, comrades, and acquaintances, many of them dying young and unexpectedly. I'm also thinking of the ongoing death of our Asian relatives, our Black relatives, relatives across waters, and so many more. So at this time, I'm actually going to ask for a moment of silence as we think about those who have journeyed on. Yeah. On March 17th, 2020, the Navajo Times released an article titled, "First Diné Tested Positive for Coronavirus." A month later, in April, COVID-19 rapidly roared through the Navajo Nation as the illness took the lives of many Navajo people, our relatives. By summer, the Navajo Nation had the highest COVID-19 infection rates per capita in the country, surpassing New York City. National media began highlighting our people as reporters traveled to Diné to cover the story. While coverage increased, much of the storyline depicted the impoverished conditions of our homelands, reproducing poverty porn imagery of our beautiful people, and broadcasting our lives throughout the world through the white gaze. That irony, that irony, that irony is another story to tell for another time. Navajo Nation leadership enforced weekend curfews and pleaded that people stay home for survival. Daily Navajo Nation President Jonathan Nez tweeted the count of total positive cases, those in recovery, and total death. Numbers were increasing, and it became harder and harder to see and feel through each day. Navajos were not the only community that was hit hard. Tribal nations and Black and Brown people were overrepresented in daily deaths and positive cases. Many of us were grappling with ongoing death in deep and profound ways, learning and desperately trying to find the strength to see the goodness in life. In November, President Nez gave an interview for NPR and stated, in quotes, "We frame this virus and compare it to monsters that have plagued our people. In our creation stories, our traditional stories, the Navajo people have fought monsters throughout time. That's our view and our perspective," end quote. Nez explained, and today we are fighting modern day monsters. Now we have a new monster, COVID-19. Nez connected the twin warrior story to the COVID-19 pandemic and referred to COVID-19 as the monster. You see, the twin warrior story tells of a time when twin brothers defeated monsters that were destroying the Navajo people. I was familiar with that story, as many Navajos are. I was moved by his declaration of asserting Diné ways as a powerful source of strength, as weapons. I agreed with him. Yet as I read the article further that featured his talk, I could not help but think differently when he spoke about the monster as COVID-19. The monster is not COVID-19. Now, this is no way disrespect or to discredit President Nez. It's an alternative way in interpreting stories and making connections with our lives. That's theorizing, building off of knowledges, story sharing, and world making. You see, I've been writing and thinking about the Twin Warriors story, Navajo college students, and the monsters and weapons that are present today. I have been working on a book that is a springboard off of my dissertation. It's tentatively titled Indigenous Weapons and Systemic Monsters, Weaving Navajo Stories of Unbelonging in College. And that work, or story rug, which is the methodological process that I create and describe in the book, I tell the stories of 10 Navajo teenagers who go to college. They are the top academic students in their class, connected to family and home, and full of hope to rise above daily struggles. These students see college as an opening to better circumstances for themselves, their family, and Native community. As they confront college enrollment and then navigate through their first year, they face hurdles that are entrenched in historical and current day policies and racism in a world where many do not understand Indigenous ways of life. They confront monsters. That is why I'm so intrigued with President Snez's usage of the twin warrior story during COVID. While intimately writing and weaving this book, I've also come to realize that the pandemic has sharpened my analysis, has helped me to define and name the monsters, their hauntings, and the indigenous weapons that Navajo students employ to keep going for survival, to survive. This speaks to the larger ways that context matters in research, and indigenous knowledge systems matter in research, indigenous presence and belonging matter in research. So thank you for allowing me to read portions of the forthcoming book for you this afternoon. You see, what I've learned from the 10 Navajo students is that there are systemic monsters, which are the interlocking structures of power rooted in white supremacy, settler colonialism, racism and neo-racism, heteropatriarchy, anti-Blackness, and capitalism that disrupt sovereignty and belonging. Systemic monsters are shape-shifting, morphing in various ways with deep intentions to maintain power over the land and peoples. Christine Sharp, in her book, Monstrous Intimacies, define monstrous intimacies as, in quotes, a set of known and unknown performances and inhabited horrors, desires, and positions produced, reproduced, circulated, and transmitted, and are breathed in like air and often unacknowledged to be monstrous, end quotes. Living in today's socio-political climate presents how the monsters plague Navajo indigenous peoples that are breathed in like air and unacknowledged. Incarceration, missing and murdered indigenous women, lack of academic achievement, suicide, diabetes, racist mascot, systemic poverty, harm and dispositions of land and waters, oppressive policies, and many more, too many to name, are tormenting Native communities. In the Navajo language, these collective challenges can be referred to as naye, which translates into English as monsters. It describes anything that disrupts hojon, which is a significantly meaningful and profound concept that encompasses all that is consumed of peace, harmony, balance, and goodness. Monsters disrupt harmony. Monsters disrupt humanity. Systemic monsters created the preconditions or hauntings for Navajo people and many more to suffer and die. Preconditions or hauntings that include lack of running water and electricity, few grocery stores across Navajo land, weak healthcare and telecommunications infrastructure and support, educational disparities, and years of neglect from a federal government who promised to care for the first peoples of this place in exchange for the land. COVID-19 is then not the monster. The monster is the deep structures of power that make it easier for COVID to spread. In the story rug, I learned from students that they confront monsters such as financial hardship monsters, the deficit not enough monster, failure monster, and invisibility monster that has its roots in settler colonialism, white supremacy, heteropatriarchy, and capitalism. The financial hardship monster rooted in settler colonialism maintain and reinforce impoverished conditions, which in turn threatened the dreams of attaining a college degree for the Navajo teenagers. The second monster, the deficit not enough monster, emerged spewing damaging perspectives about college possibilities and self-worth. Before students even entered into college, these two monsters worked together to generate barriers while constructing normative standards or whiteness of who belongs and who does not belong in college settings. For these students who eventually did enter into college, they faced the fear of failure monster, a relative to the financial hardship and deficit not enough monsters that asserted and maintained meritocracy and neoliberal standards of whiteness, standards of belonging that is cloaked in language of success. Then the invisibility monster, rooted in erasure, worked to diminish possible selves and further evoke questions of belonging. Native students were then put in positions that presume that they are in need of fixing instead of our institutions. They grow in strength, these monsters, when they work together to disrupt and erase Navajo presence and freedom. They strategize with each other with the knowledge that when they work together, the impact is greater. This was evident when I learned how students became dispassionate about college when they lived through financial struggle, when they were denied a scholarship, and when they were told over and over again that they were not enough. As much as we may think that tough life situations are separate from larger social conditions, I'm here to tell you, and I think many of you already know, that they are often related. We have to figure out the relations and lineages of the monsters, learn the history and the context that shapes and strengthens them, and then see the connections. Name it too. Name the monsters. Monsters are working on us so that we can relinquish the deep relationships we have with the land, our lifeways, with each other, with more than human relatives, and the great divine. Leanne Simpson refers to these interlocking systems of power as expansive disposition, which is defined as the, in quotes, gendered removal of our bodies and minds from our nation and place-based grounded normativities, end quotes. Glenn Cawthorne names these as constellation of power relations that sustain colonial power and their inner and external functions embedded in structures, behaviors, and relationships. Sandy Grande names these as intersecting systems of domination. I call them systemic monsters. Systemic monsters are shape-shifting, morphing in different ways, but deep within, they remain to maintain power over the land and peoples. Octavia Butler in Parables of the Sawyer wrote, in quotes, "Beware, at war or at peace, more people die of unenlightened self-interest than of any other disease," end quotes. Self-interests are the monsters rooted in capitalism, settler colonialism, white supremacy, anti-Blackness, heteropatriarchy. We need to see and name the long-standing monsters and fight resistance that destroy their power and hauntings. They are killing us more, even more than COVID. I see COVID-19 as the hauntings brought forth from the monsters. Eve Tuck and Siri write about the glossary of haunting, that foreground justice, and about righting and sometimes wronging wrongs, that provides another way to understand settler colonialism and decolonization. Inspired by their writing, I take up the framing of haunting, but instead of viewing it as through a justice lens as Teak and Ree have used, I see hauntings of monsters from a complicated view where we can see and feel through the opaqueness and violence of injustices and oppression brought forth by the monsters, in hopes of not fearing what is right before our eyes, felt through our senses. The preconditions are then the hauntings, the ongoing everyday suffering and struggles that function to uphold the inferiority of people. Hauntings in this case is what Avery F. Gordon states as, in quotes, one way in which abusive systems of power make themselves known and their impacts felt in everyday life, especially when they are supposedly over and done with, slavery, for instance, or when their oppressive nature is denied, end quotes. Supposedly over and done with is critical here because hauntings are not cast aside as some like to behave. They live and cling in the now. Dion Brand wrote, in quotes, how imprisoned we are in their ghosts, end quotes, reminding us that in many ways we get trapped in the hauntings. Lakota scholar Nick Estes gave an interview for In Country Today on the impacts of COVID and Native peoples. In the interview, he discussed that more people suffer not from the war, but the conditions of the war, meaning that although many of our relatives are in anguish and dying from COVID, much ongoing suffering remain from the conditions, prior, present, and future, of economic hardships, lack of basic living needs, social ills, lack of support, educational disparities, and so much more brought forth from the monsters. Many of us have been praying for our people, for their protection against COVID. We must also place focus on protection against the systemic monsters of white supremacy, settler colonialism, racism, anti-Blackness, heteropatriarchy, and capitalism. What are some hauntings for Native college students? So this is a question that you can write in the chat. It's a question for you to think about. It's a question that I'm thinking about. And the answer that I've received from the work that I'm doing has helped me to see this a little bit more. So let me share that with you. The hauntings of the monsters was that all 10 students acknowledged concerns on how they would be able to afford paying for college. The hauntings from the deficit not enough monster distorts natives as least likely to do well in school and graduate with a high school degree, let alone a college degree. The hauntings create illusionary conceptions of nativeness with perceptions that there is a certain way to be native. Hauntings are the conditions that pathologize the challenges upon the people. College campuses are full of a hauntings culture, where Native students question belonging and their presence. 2020 was erupting while I was writing my book. Time and context were my teachers. I was continuously which brought me back to the question I asked earlier, who belongs in college settings? In higher education, sense of belonging is often referred to as an, in quotes, individual sense of belonging to a particular group and his or her feelings of morale associate with membership in the group. Not surprisingly, research has demonstrated that white students have the greatest sense of belonging relative to students of color. This makes sense given that college campuses are predominantly white, with students, faculty, administrators, curriculum, and programming that looks, speaks to, and caters to them. This is called ontological expansiveness, which means the privilege to have access to both physical and metaphorical space. Predominantly white colleges are then sites of white space, such that the proliferation of whiteness as property is maintained. Students share the overwhelming experience of not belonging and their attempts to belong to these white spaces or campus environments. We must then examine conceptions of belonging a bit more and question who determines belonging, who sets the terms of who belongs and does not belong, and how do the monsters form belonging. Based upon these student stories, we must contend with how in many ways campus environments are fertile ground for what I refer to as monsters' sense of belonging, which is assimilating, erasing, diminishing, harming those whose worldviews are not rooted in white supremacy, capitalism, and heteropatriarchy. A monster sense of belonging creates a culture that intensifies failure and invisibility. I'm going to turn off my slides now and continue to read portions of my work in progress. Recently, I listened to a webinar presented by Sandy Grande. The title of her talk was The Endemics of Pandemics at the Settler University. She contoured on ways settler universities continue to uphold racial capitalist, neoliberal, settler colonial, anti-Blackness aims, especially during interludes of pandemics. She stopped me in my tracks when she mentioned belonging. She stated, in quotes, "If you have any doubts, try refusing the gift of belonging and suffer the social isolation, the institutional marginalization, the ghosting, and sometimes even retribution. While we might rightfully fear the impact of exclusion on self, on career, on family, on community, we need to consider the price of belonging. What are the costs of being invited to the table, of being included in the dialogue, of being the first, the only, to being singled out as the good ones," end quote. This is true. If we believe a sense of belonging means having a membership with systemic monsters, what are the costs to our sense of self and community? Possibly then there is a process of unbelonging, a recognition in the politics of belonging. This was brought to my attention when reading Unsettled Belonging, Educating Palestinian American Youth After 9/11 by Thea Renda Abu El-Hajj. She states in quotes, "In speaking of the politics of belonging, I referenced the way that feeling part of a collectivity, particularly a national collectivity, is never given, but instead is actively constructed through political projects," end quotes. Construction of belonging are actively imagined and immutable over time through discourse and practice by those in power, by systemic monsters. What if we peel ourselves from a monster sense of belonging, a practice of unbelonging, and a reconceptualizing of belonging from our ethical engagements and land-based sensibilities? We must then look at belonging from our worldview. With Nolan Cabrera and Eliza Yellowbird, we wrote about peoplehood sense of belonging, which takes into account intertwined aspects of language, sacred history, ceremonial, cycle, and land. We adopted the peoplehood model that was formed by Tom Home, a Cherokee Muskogee Creek scholar. Peoplehood was deliberately utilized from the concept of persistent peoples, to acknowledge that we are still here despite centuries-old systemic monsters and their hauntings assaulting our livelihood. Language, sacred history, ceremonial cycle, and land speak to our complex and sophisticated experience where belonging is rooted to a place and land and connected to our ancestors and relatives. From a peoplehood sense of belonging perspective, we are not attempting to fit into whiteness, white supremacy, and the other systemic monsters' undoing. We are reminded that the land is our relative and that campuses may sit on the land, but institutions are not in relation to the land as we are. The land can remind us that we belong here, everywhere, and elsewhere. Yet it may not be that simple to fully separate from systemic monsters. There is definitely power in knowing our peoplehood sense of belonging, but we have to constantly contend with living in a nation state and global world where systemic monsters live with and among us. What I learned from these students is they are constantly negotiating through multiple worlds, not simply two worlds, multiple worlds, such that belonging is shaped and redefined depending upon context, time, experiences, and knowledges. From this perspective, they show us that they are forming what I am calling relational sovereign belonging, which is the moving through and honoring of self-determination while intricately woven to relations, including ancestors, more than human relatives, land, place, and even to monsters. It's living in complexity, nuances, paradox, and contradictions. Relational sovereign belonging is recognizing that there is not one way of being native in the 21st century. Relation sovereign belonging is a knowing of the sacredness and multitudes of brilliance that we offer, while also reckoning with the reality that we are not separated from the monsters. Living and being Navajo in these times can feel like we are in constant battle, and many times those battles are unnoticed by you and others. Students indicated weariness, they skipped sleep, they felt depleted. They all worried about their finances, academics, family, sense of self and belonging. Worry stole their joy and peace away. That is why it is important to listen to your body, spirit, and mind. When I returned to the Navajo twin warrior story, I learned that after the twin warriors destroyed the monsters, they rested. Very wise for the twins to rest, as sometimes rest is too often neglected, not even spoken of. Remember that. You must rest too because you are fighting monsters right now. The Net Ministry stated that in quotes, "We are not created to live in a cycle of grief and fighting. We are not created for scarcity and trauma. Please do not internalize the exhausting fight and battle constantly narrative. You can rest. Rest and slowing down is a political process to," end quotes, rest. If you need to take a nap now, do it, please. As I learn more about the monsters in our Navajo stories, it is said that monsters were created by us. Our people in worlds before helped to form the monsters that the twin warriors defeated. Long ago, the people were fighting with and against each other, living in disharmony and acting in ways that were not aligned with Hojon. Their acts then generated the monsters and then destroyed the people, reminding us how powerful our actions are in the creation of things and beings. When we return to these Navajo teachings, we can see that there is a cause and effect relationship occurring between monsters and us. Causality manifested, relationality. A recognition that despite not wanting to be near or part of monsters, we are always connected to them. We even assisted to create them. What does that mean for systemic monsters that are rooted in white supremacy, settler colonialism, assimilation, capitalism, heteropatriarchy, and racism? It is to recognize that those monsters were also created by people, but reconstructed by us, meaning we can reproduce those monsters too. It is a recognition that this harmony and discourse among relations between people, land, and more than human relatives generated those monsters. Teachings that remind us that we create monsters and that we are constructing them now, and that they can later attack us and our relatives if they are not already doing so. Just because you are Native does not mean you do not operate and recreate whiteness and white supremacy. Remember, whiteness is the normalization and the everyday that we take for granted as simply how the world works without examining why we do certain things and how those actions may harm or disenfranchise ourselves and others. including the land and our more than human relatives. But if we again return to the Navajo teachings of why monsters remain, we can also understand our relationship with systemic monsters. Systemic monsters remind us of our indigenous weapons. To settler colonialism may tell us to rise, resurgence, to care and protect the land and our loved ones. Assimilation asks us to keep going, llego, continuance, and learn our indigenous ways centered upon relationality. Meritocracy teaches us to practice reverence by acknowledging that we are sacred and brilliant in our own ways and terms. Racism and erasure instills in us to look away, refusal from the monster's depictions of us, and be in the knowing of our sovereignty and belonging in our terms. In my lifetime, we may not be able to defeat the systematic monsters and their hauntings that are plaguing our people. But what we and you can do is sharpen our indigenous weapons and, like the twin warriors, fight and rest as you negotiate through relational sovereign belonging. We are also reminded that the world that we are living in today is not a two-world dichotomy, but the glittering world. That is our sacred history and present. We live in the glittering world. Our ancestors emerged into the glittering world. That is in our creation stories. You see, glittering world is much more sophisticated than two worlds. Glitter like a rainbow, as sovereign, is a reflection of an assemblage of brilliant, sparkling luster, far greater than two colors. We recognize that there were worlds before us and there will be worlds after us. Brilliance, a span of phases tempered by the change in the patterns of the stars and moon, the awareness of transformation occurring within ourselves, other beings, and the universe. We have existed in worlds before us, in the glittering world and in the worlds to come. And we survived and changed through world making, and we will do the same moving forward. This is in our stories and teachings. We are in the glittering world. Yeah, thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that. I have so many notes. We will. Well, first, I just want to say thank you, and then give you a couple of moments if you want to drink some water. There you go, or take a moment. And then I want to invite all of our participants to please write in any questions, comments that you might have to engage with our speaker.